Hi, I'm Daniel Friedman, one of Eric's behind the scenes people, de-lurking to reveal how not to do a video, but more importantly, to offer a few thoughts on making a difference in the world and how you would most like to be remembered. In fact, I've been a behind the scenes guy my whole life. I worked for more than 20 years in television as a producer and news executive, and then for mission driven organizations like PBS and the Environmental Defense Fund. And the common thread really has a lot to do with what personal trainers do for a living, making a difference in the world, changing the world, and changing lives. So, what it all boils down to, really, I think, is how you would most like to be remembered. What would you like people to say about you at your funeral? So that kind of brought to mind a eulogy I gave at a funeral about 5 years ago for a friend and a mentor, a man by the name of Neil McKenty, who was a Jesuit priest turned author and broadcaster. And this is what I said about Neil. See if it resonates with you. Some people make a difference in the world. Neil McKenty was one of those people. Though he often led a troubled life himself, Neil ended up making the world a better place. That's because he touched so many lives. Mine was one of them. Like so many others, I grew up listening to Neil on CJD radio in Montreal and realized he was more than special, he was unique. Nobody did a call-in show like Neil. His gift went beyond putting his fierce intellect to work in building bridges at a time in Quebec when a lot of people were trying to blow up bridges, not build them. That's because Neil actually listened, kind of a crucial skill for us all. In Neil's case, he could get politicians to actually think on the air and say something unexpected and newsworthy. He could also get callers to open up about the most intimate details of their lives. And it's all because he listened and because he cared. Life's rich pageant unfolds in unexpected ways. One day in about 1987, I was surprised to find myself in my boss's office meeting Neil for the first time to discuss the possibility of reviving his program for television. In fact, the program went ahead and I became the producer. Kind of a funny story happened the first day. My boss, in his largesse, made the grandiose gesture of sending a limousine to pick up Neil every morning. But since this was Montreal and not Hollywood, the so-called limousine turned out to be a very big, but very old and very noisy Cadillac. So much for the limo. And because I lived near Neil, this ridiculous vehicle also stopped to pick me up. On that first morning, Neil said to me in the back of the so-called limo, "This is really a bit much." He was embarrassed. I later learned that Neil had once turned down a suite at a hotel. The suite was to have been his reward for speaking at a conference, but Neil was embarrassed at the fuss, and he actually asked for a regular room instead, kind of like our current Pope. That was Neil. He hated pretense. He hated hypocrisy. I saw him show the same respect for a makeup artist, a stagehand, or a waitress that he showed for a professor or prime minister. His idea of a good time was dinner and dancing with his wife Catherine at the Ribbon Reef restaurant, which, trust me, is not exactly the starlight roof of the Waldorf Astoria. Neil once said to me, "I've made many mistakes in my life, but I got one thing right. I married Catherine, which makes me the luckiest guy alive." I long ago concluded that Neil was one of the most complicated and interesting men who ever lived. For much of his life, Neil wrestled with the worst of demons. He wrote of his struggles with depression, alcoholism, and even suicidal thoughts in his autobiography. But throughout it all, and amazingly, and beyond the somewhat formidable exterior, Neil also had a great gift for friendship and for mentorship. I worked on Neil's program with two exceptional colleagues, Joan Tackefman and Wendy Helfenbaum. We called our team Three Jews and a Jesuit, and we kept threatening to get t-shirts printed. We never did, but we really should have. Anyway, the point is you never knew what to expect from Neil. He could be funny, he could be demanding, he could be endearing, and Lord knows he could be exasperating, all in the same conversation. Neil seemed to have bionic ears, perhaps acquired during his tenure as a teacher in the Jesuits. Neil had an uncanny ability to overhear what we were saying and correct our many errors of logic from afar, all in that booming voice so familiar to everyone. But we always knew that Neil cared about us. In fact, Neil cared about a lot of things. He cared about the truth. He cared about humanity. He cared about the church, with which he was so often at odds. Earlier in his career, when asked to comment about the Pope's visit to Montreal, Neil uttered the immortal words, "I'm having an ecclesiastical orgasm." Who else could have gotten away with it, but amazingly Neil did. On one occasion, we experienced kind of every producer's nightmare. Everything went wrong. Technically, Neil was left alone on camera. He had no guests to talk to. The phone lines failed. He was utterly alone. It would have flummoxed most broadcasters, but not Neil. Talking and arguing was never a problem for him. So if he had to argue with himself, well, that just made it more fun. So Neil ad-libbed for almost 15 minutes, making such perfect sense that the viewers thought it had all been planned. One thing stands out above all else. Above all, Neil was always interested in justice. I'm sure Neil is already in heaven, and I suspect he's already fighting to make it a better place, arguing that it is too unfair and too many people are excluded. After all, Neil always fought the good fight. Why would he stop now? Wow. So that was the eulogy for Neil. And, 5 years later, what occurs to me is that Neil is still remembered. A posthumous collection of his writings was published. His wife and his associates are maintaining his blog. A lot of his charitable work continues. So of Neil McKenty, it might actually be said that he made a difference in the world. And that is your opportunity to make a difference in the world, to seek mentors, to be a mentor to others. And, maybe Eric and I can help you along that road. So please keep reading. You can read a bit more about me further down on the page. Read about what we offer, and if you think we could help, we'd love to speak further with you. Thanks.